Well, hey there, I'm in the studio today with Tracy, my wife, and we're going to bring you through the first lesson in our new mentor training series. Now, when we use the word mentoring, what are we talking about, of course?
Disciple making.
Right. So here's the thing. Most people in the early church, most early Christians made disciples. It was normal, it's what they did, right? But today, hardly anyone does it. Would you agree with that? What percentage of Christians today would you think makes disciples?
Well, I mean, I certainly couldn't give you a number, but it would be very low.
Yeah.
I mean, I would sadly say it's less than 1% probably.
Yeah. And so that's why we've put this series together. That's actually why we've put PursueGOD.org together, because I think the reason most people don't make disciples is because they don't know how to.
Right.
Right? If we were to say to somebody, go out and make a disciple, they'd say, what do I do? Where do I start?
Well,
Right?
they would probably say, I don't know, do I just invite him to church? Isn't that what the pastor's supposed to do?
Yeah.
Don't you make the disciple, I just get him there?
Yeah.
That's not what disciple making should be about.
Right. And that's why we actually use the word mentoring, because we want to make sure that it's really clear. We're going to talk in this video about why we should make disciples, why you should make disciples if you're watching this. Don't look around at the next person. We're talking to you. Why should you make disciples? In the next video, lesson 2, we'll get into the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of how to actually do it,
Yes.
right? But let's just start with the fact that Jesus, when he came to the earth, he didn't start a church, he made disciples.
Right.
He gathered 12 guys around him, and then he made disciples.
And I think it's a key to remember the kind of guys he was around.
Yeah.
He didn't go to the Pharisees and the religious leaders. He went to the fishermen, just the common,
Regular
average
people.
Joe, the uneducated. Yeah.
And that's how Christianity is supposed to work. In fact, Jesus came, made some disciples, made 12 disciples. One of them was a dud. And then he left. He died on the cross, rose from the dead, and he left. But the disciples that he made stayed behind. And the church was started by these simple fishermen disciples of Jesus who became disciple makers, right? Let me read this, Matthew 4. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw 2 brothers, Simon, who's now called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. Now, he didn't pick Pharisees. What do you think would have maybe happened if he picked Pharisees? The religious elite of the day, right?
Well, I think they probably would have been like, "We got it, Jesus. We've studied the law. We know what we're talking about." Or they wouldn't have been as open to, they wouldn't have been as free maybe to say, "Hey, maybe you're on to something." They would probably feel like, we've got an established way we do things around here.
Right. But he picked fishermen who were willing.
Yes.
And he said from the very beginning, I think it's interesting, he said from the very beginning, go, I'm going to make you fishers of men. So from the very beginning, he had in mind that he was going to make his followers into disciple makers.
And I think it's interesting in the story that they immediately drop their nets and go. Whereas I feel like the smarter we think we are, the more we think we know, we're not as eager to just go, to just take the plunge or take the risk and go.
Right.
We've got our reservations, we have our reasons why it's not safe, or it doesn't seem like that's the right thing to do.
Right. Now again, we're talking in this video about the why of disciple making. So we'll talk in the next video about how to actually do it. So just pay attention to this next point, because I think this is important. Disciple making does what sermons can't do. Because I think the church is turned into, if you go to a church, probably in your church, you think, okay, if I'm a good Christian, I go to church and I listen to a sermon and I go home. And I go to church and I listen to the next sermon and I go home. And, not to oversimplify, that's really what Christianity has boiled down to for so many people. But that's not, again, what Jesus had in mind.
Right.
Sermons can't do what one-on-one or one-on-2 or 3 mentoring can do, right? Explain that.
Yeah, because I think when you're sitting in church listening to a sermon, though there's great godly wisdom and biblical truth coming, but it's a very passive response. You're just listening to the information. You can't interrupt in the sermon and be like, "Hey, pastor, I don't know what that means," or "What does that mean for my life?" But when you're in a mentoring relationship and actually having a conversation and talking with someone, you can wrestle with that biblical truth and really personally apply it in that moment.
And that, again, that's what mentoring is. Again, we'll get into the details of how to do it. Our tools make it easy for you. We just want to make sure as you're watching this, you're applying this to your life. I know maybe your heart is beating fast, like saying, I want to stop this video because I am not a discipler. I am not a mentor. I'm not qualified for that. But again, the early disciples, the fishermen, certainly weren't qualified either. I would challenge you to say, you know more of the Bible than the early disciples did, and yet they did it, and this is how Jesus had it in mind. In fact, in Matthew 9, Jesus preaches this great sermon, probably better than any sermon you or I have ever heard. And then he said this in verse 36, he said, when he saw the crowds after the sermon, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest field. And what's interesting is this, I as a pastor, I can relate to how Jesus felt, because I've preached sermons before, and I know that there are people in there that need to do something with this sermon, but I know what's going to happen. It's going to go in one ear, out the other, because they don't have a shepherd.
Right.
They don't have someone who's going to walk with them through that topic and maybe a dozen other topics and help them have victory over an area of their life, or maybe help them put their faith in Christ.
Right.
Sermons just don't. Jesus knew that even his own sermon couldn't do it. And so his solution, so simple, read that passage for yourself. His solution was pray for people to go into the harvest field.
Right.
And what's interesting is in the next chapter, he sent his disciples out into the harvest field. So again, I encourage you to keep this in mind. Jesus wants you, if you're a follower of Jesus, he wants you to be a mentor, a disciple maker, someone who's going to walk alongside someone, invest in them personally until they come to faith in Christ and the rest of the full circle, until they go full circle in their own life, right? This is what Jesus wants. In fact, this is what this circle is. This is this third thing. If you took foundations, a full circle disciple isn't just someone who trusts Jesus and honors God, but it's someone who goes out and helps someone else trust Jesus and honor God, right? That's the picture we're going for. So what we like to say is that the church is broken without a culture of discipleship. What does a culture of discipleship mean?
Well, to me, it means that everybody that considers themselves to be a follower of Jesus is in the game, wanting and willing to help. That they're saying, okay, I can help somebody get through this circle, and I can use the tools on PursueGOD, and I can use the method that's represented there, which we'll talk about in later videos, and I can do that. Because at the end of the day, as you said in Matthew chapter 9, there's hurting people in this world. And just coming to church and hearing the sermon just it's not gonna do the change that they need. They need someone to walk with them. So the more people we have that say, I can do that, I understand that's a call on my life to do that. When the Great Commission says, go and make disciples and teach them all the things that I've commanded you, that's not an option. It's what every Christian should be doing.
It's like we all know that verse, but hardly anyone is doing it.
We don't really do it, right?
And again, I think the reason nobody is doing it is because nobody knows how to do it. So that's what we're going to cover in the next lesson, and we hope you'll get to that lesson. But before you do, use the questions below to talk about this particular topic, the why of disciple making, with your mentor or with a small group, and then we hope to see you in the next lesson.